Chapter 5. Zarathustra Prophesies. The greatest arms race the world had known was not only waged among mutually hostile nations, busily planning to destroy one another, but took place in a civilization in which it was widely believed that only destruction could bring regeneration. The prophet of the age was the powerfully eloquent, though unsystematic philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Nietzsche preached the values of the irrational. Though he was German, his message struck a chord in many countries. He was a European figure, not a parochial German one. Fittingly, he made his home in Switzerland and Italy. The French Revolution of 1789 had ushered in a century of revolutions that had failed to achieve the dreams they embodied. Unfulfilled revolutions and revolutions betrayed had left Europe frustrated, and in a mood, following Nietzsche, to smash things. Rejecting Europe's inherited values, Nietzsche had proclaimed in Thus Spake Zarathustra that God is dead. The debut of the Stravinsky-Nijinsky ballet Le Sacre du Printemps on May 29, 1913, at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, is often taken as the symbol of the Nietzschean rebellion in all the arts. Crowds hating the ballet, a pagan celebration with deafening dissonances, screamed their protests against what they regarded as savagery exalted in the place of civilization. Hysteria and frenzy seemed to be the order of the day. It may well be that the European sense of frustration, the sense of stalemate in life, art, and politics, led to a violent sense of abandon, of letting go, a sense that the world ought to be blown up, and let the consequences be what they may. Europe's Nietzschean mood seemed to play some sort of role in making the Great War possible. As A.J.P. Taylor writes, men's minds seem to have been on edge in the last 2 or 3 years before the war in a way they had not been before, as though they had become unconsciously weary of peace and security. You can see it in things remote from international politics, in the artistic movement called Futurism, in the militant suffragettes, in the working class trend toward syndicalism. Men wanted violence for its own sake, they welcomed war as a relief from materialism. European civilization was, in fact, breaking down even before war destroyed it. In the opening years of the 20th century, Europeans glorified violence, and certain groups among them, at least, felt a need for radical change. Across the whole spectrum of existence, change was overcoming Europe at a pace faster than ever before, and far faster than Europe knew how to cope with. A panoramic view of Europe in the years 1900 to 1914 would show prominently that the continent was racing ahead in a scientific, technological, and industrial revolution, powered by almost limitless energy, that was transforming almost everything. That violence was endemic in the service of social, economic, political, class, ethnic, and national strife. That Europe focused its activities largely on an escalating, dizzying arms race on a scale that the world never had seen before. And that, in the center of the continent's affairs, powerful, dynamic Germany had made strategic arrangements such that, if it went to war, it would bring almost all Europe and much of the rest of the planet into the war for or against it. Given these conditions, does not the question how could war have broken out in such a peaceful world rather answer itself? Would it not have been more to the point to ask how statesmen could have continued to avoid war much longer? How had they managed to keep the peace for so long? Which is not to say that war could not have been averted, but merely that, by 1914, it might have taken extraordinary skill to keep on averting it. Today, we take it for granted that governments hope to keep the peace. It is our often unarticulated assumption. Since the development of weapons of mass destruction, everybody would lose, we say, if war were to break out among the great powers. The human race, we are told, might not survive such a conflict. Our principal international institution, the United Nations, is described as a peacekeeping organization because preventing war is the primary reason that the countries of the earth have joined together. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that a century ago world leaders would have shared such a view. Their thinking at the time was well expressed in what has been called the first great speech in the political career of Theodore Roosevelt, newly appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the incoming administration of U.S. President William McKinley. Addressing the Naval War College in 1897, Roosevelt claimed, "No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war." War, he declared, was a fine and healthy thing. All the great masterful races have been fighting races, and the minute that a race loses the hard fighting virtues, then, it has lost its proud right to stand as the equal of the best. He argued, cowardice in a race, as in an individual, is the unpardonable sin. Someday circumstances might be different, he said, but until they were, war would continue to be needed. As yet no nation can hold its place in the world, or can do any work really worth doing unless it stands ready to guard its rights with an armed hand. The speech was reprinted in full in all major American newspapers, and the chorus of approval from the press all around the United States made it clear that Roosevelt was not speaking for himself alone. He lived in a world in which war was considered desirable, even necessary. Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, Chief of Staff of the Dual Monarchy's armed forces, was another leader who frequently expressed his opinion that war was the basic principle behind all the events on this earth. It also, as he saw it, was the key to personal success. He was carrying on a love affair with a married woman, and was of the view that if he could come back from the battlefield as a war hero, his mistress could be persuaded to leave her wealthy husband. The pursuit of honor was a frequent theme of the times. In Conrad's personal vision, a warrior's nobility wins him the love of women, and the acclaim of men. Heads of state and government in the conflicts of 1914 were to argue that their country's honor compelled them to join in the fray. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson used the concept in his address to Congress in 1917 asking for a declaration of war against Germany. Some, Conrad was one, and his octogenarian emperor Franz Joseph was another, at times felt that they had to lead their country into a war because of their code of honor, even if they were likely to lose. These views, held by warriors and aristocrats on the one hand, and by many artists and intellectuals on the other, were not necessarily shared by the masses, including workers, farmers, and the peace-loving commercial and middle classes. But the public played no role in the war and peace decisions that they did not even know were being made behind closed doors. The several dozen leaders who did discuss and decide these matters lived in a world of their own, and it was a world in which war and warriors were glorified. Chapter 6. Diplomats Align. Among the great powers of Europe, peace had prevailed from 1871 to 1914. It was a long run. It is at least arguable that what had made that achievement possible was not only the skill but also the character and the outlook of Europe's statesmen. In large part they were a sort of extended family, monarchs and aristocrats whom the French Revolution had failed to sweep away. Shaped by the tolerance and the values of the 18th century, they had kept their positions and their system throughout the 19th. They were bound together by ties of education, of culture, and, in many cases, of blood. The conduct of foreign affairs was their shared vocation. Cosmopolitan and disinclined to prejudices, they tended at times to put the welfare of Europe as a whole ahead of that of their own country. Indeed, it was not unusual for a diplomat to take service with a foreign country, for a German or a Corsican, for example, to serve as foreign minister of Russia. Once, a long time before, it is true, an Austrian, the Count of Stanville, had been Vienna's envoy to Paris at the same time that his son was Paris's envoy to Vienna. Hans Morgenthau, 1904–80, the great 20th century theorist of international relations, describes the way it used to be in terms that exude nostalgia. In the 17th and 18th centuries, and to a lessening degree up to the First World War, international morality was the concern of a personal sovereign, that is, a certain individual prince and his successors, and of a relatively small, cohesive, and homogeneous group of aristocratic rulers. The prince and the aristocratic rulers of a particular nation were in constant, intimate contact with the princes and aristocratic rulers of other nations. They were joined together by family ties, a common language, French, common cultural values, a common style of life, and common moral convictions about what a gentleman was and was not allowed to do in his relations with another gentleman, whether of his own or of a foreign nation. In other words, they played the game of world politics as though it had rules. The loss of aristocratic values and the weakening of ties were what made the behavior of some of the statesmen in July 1914 possible. In our democratic age, we tend to forget how great a role continued to be played by kings and emperors and by the hereditary aristocracy as recently as a century ago, not merely by their values and their codes of conduct, but by themselves. We have been reminded of it by a study that has just been published, Royalty and Diplomacy in Europe, 1890 to 1914, by Roderick R. MacLean. Personal friendships among monarchs could help to bring countries together. The reverse could also be true. Both possibilities could be seen at work in the ambivalent relationship between the two most powerful continental emperors, Nicholas II of Russia and Wilhelm II of Germany. Each could exercise almost absolute powers within his country in matters of war and peace. Tsar Nicholas II succeeded to the Russian throne at the end of 1894 and was crowned the following year. Deferential and inexperienced, he had been described only shortly before by his father as inadequate. He is nothing but a boy, whose judgments are childish. Kaiser Wilhelm II undertook to guide his young relative through the jungles of world politics. There was nearly a decade's age difference between the two. Moreover, Nicholas was hesitant where Wilhelm was assertive. The young Tsar was so polite that the Kaiser believed he was hearing agreement even when he was not. Wilhelm initiated a secret correspondence with him that lasted for nearly 2 decades. At first Nicholas welcomed the letters. In 1896 the two emperors met for a conference in Breslau, in what now is Poland. Agreements between them were reached easily. But Wilhelm's desire to tutor and dominate turned Nicholas against him. From then on, the Tsar regarded the Kaiser with a dislike bordering on hostility. Nicholas decided that he wanted to break off their correspondence. Ignoring Nicholas's desires, Wilhelm continued to write to him for a further 18 years. On occasion the two rulers did hold meetings. After one such, in 1902, Nicholas commented, "He's raving mad." From time to time the Kaiser did seem to exert some influence. He may have played a part in persuading the Tsar to involve his empire in a war against Japan, 1904-05, a war that proved to be a disaster. Mostly, however, Nicholas preferred neither to see nor to hear from his tiresome relative. In this he was not alone. Queen Victoria, the Kaiser's grandmother, warned Nicholas against Wilhelm's mischievous and unstraightforward proceedings. To her prime minister, Victoria described Wilhelm as a hot-headed, conceited, and wrong-headed young man. She did not invite Wilhelm to her Diamond Jubilee, 1897, or to her 80th birthday celebration, 1899. In his own version of history, the Kaiser described himself as Victoria's favorite grandson. For all of the German emperor's failings, he was a blood relative and was treated as such. This solidarity among cousins was a sentiment that made for peace and stability between the Tsar and the Kaiser. MacLean tells us, until at least 1908, both monarchs remained convinced that neither would undertake a hostile act against the other. These personal relationships played their role in the story of how Europe managed not to have a war among the great powers in the opening years of the 20th century. But ultimately family ties did not succeed in relaxing the tensions that arose among the powers. Indeed, it would have taken statesmanship of a high order to guide the countries of Europe through the explosive issues with which they had to deal. It was like walking through minefields.